Chapter number 19. No bird pie for Mr. Twit. The next morning, when Mr. Twit came out with his huge basket to snatch all the birds from the big dead tree, there wasn't a single one on it. They were all sitting on top of the monkey's cage. The roly-poly bird was there as well, and Mugglewump and his family. They were all inside the cage, and the whole lot of them were laughing at Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit was not going to wait another week for his bird pie supper. He loved bird pie. It was his favourite meal. So, the very same day, he went after the birds again. But this time, he smeared the top of the monkey cage with the hug-tight glue. As well as the branches of the big dead tree. Now, I'll get you, whichever one you sit on. The monkeys crouched inside the cage watching all of this, and later on, when the roly-poly bird came swooping down for their evening chat, they shouted out, "Don't land on the cage, roly-poly bird! It's covered in the sticky glue, and so is the tree!" That evening, as the sun went down and all the birds came in to roost, the roly-poly bird flew round and around the monkey cage and around the big dead tree, shouting out his warning. "There's sticky stuff now on the cage and the tree. If you land on either, you'll never be free. So fly away, stay up high, or you'll finish up tomorrow in a hot bird pie." Chapter 21. Mr. and Mrs. Twit go off to buy guns. The next morning, when Mr. Twit came out with his huge basket, not a single bird was sitting on top of the monkey's cage, nor were they sitting on top of the tree. They were all perched happily on the roof of Mr. Twit's house. The roly-poly bird was up there as well, and the monkeys were in the cage, and the whole lot of them were hooting with laughter at Mr. Twit. "Oh, wipe that silly laugh off your beaks!" Mr. Twit screamed at the birds. "I'll get you next time, you filthy, feathery frumps! I'll wring your necks, the whole lot of you, and I'll have you bubbling in a pot for bird pie before this day is out." "How are you going to do that?" asked Mrs. Twit, who'd come outside to see what all the noise was about. "I won't have you smearing sticky glue all up on the roof of our house." Mr. Twit got very excited. "I've got a great idea," he cried. He didn't even bother to keep his voice down because he didn't think that the monkeys could understand. "We'll both go into town right away and we'll buy a gun each," he shouted. "How's that?" "Brilliant," cried Mrs. Twit, grinning and showing her long yellow teeth. "We'll buy those big shotguns that spray out 50 bullets or more with each bang." "Exactly," said Mr. Twit. "Lock up the house while I go and make sure those monkeys are safely shut in their cage." Mr. Twit went over to the monkey's cage. "Attention!" he barked in a fearsome monkey trainer's voice. "Upside down, all of you! Jump to it, hop to it, one on top of the other, quick! Get on with it, or you'll feel Mrs. Twit's cane across your backsides." Obediently, the poor monkeys stood on their hands and clambered one on top of each other, with Mugglewump at the bottom and the smallest child perched on top. "Now, Stay there until we get back, Mr. Twit ordered. Don't you dare move. And don't overbalance. When we return in 2 or 3 hours' time, I shall expect to find you in exactly the same position as you are now. Do you understand? With that, Mr. Twit marched away. Mrs. Twit went with him, and the monkeys were left alone with the birds. Chapter 22. Mugglewump has an idea. As soon as Mr. and Mrs. Twit had disappeared down the road, the monkeys all flipped back onto their feet the right way up. Quick, get the key, Mugglewump called out to the roly-poly bird, who was still sitting on the roof of the house. What key? Shouted the roly-poly bird. The key to the cage, cried Mugglewump. It's hanging on a nail in the work shed. That's where he always puts it. Roly-poly bird flew down and came back with a key in its beak. Mugglewump reached a hand through the bars of the cage and took the key. He put it in the lock and turned it. The door opened and all 4 monkeys leapt out together. We're free! Cried the little ones. Where shall we go, Dad? Where shall we hide? Don't get too excited, said Mugglewump. Calm down, everybody. Before we escape from this beastly place, we have one very important thing to do. What? They asked him. We're going to turn those terrible twits upside down. We're gonna do what? They cried. You must be joking, Dad. I'm not joking, Mugglewump said. We're going to turn both Mr. and Mrs. Twit upside down, and their legs will be in the air. Don't be ridiculous, the roly-poly bird said. How can we possibly turn those maggoty old people into upside down? We can, shouted Mugglewump. We're going to make them stand on their heads for hours and hours, maybe even forever. Let them see what it feels like for a change. How? Said the roly-poly bird. Just tell me how. Mugglewump laid his head on one side. A tiny twinkling little smile around the corners of his mouth. Now and again, he said, I have a brilliant idea. This is one of them. Follow me, friends, follow me. And he scampered off towards the house, 3 other monkeys and a roly-poly bird after him. Buckets and paintbrushes, cried Mugglewump. That's what we want next. There's plenty in the workshed. Hurry up, everyone, get a bucket and a paintbrush. Inside Mr. Twit's workshed, there was an enormous barrel of hug-tight, sticky glue, the stuff that he used for catching the birds. Fill your buckets, Mugglewump declared. We're now going to the big house. Mrs. Twit had hidden the key to the front door under the mat. Mugglewump had seen her doing it, so it was easy for them all to get in. In they went, all 4 monkeys, with their own buckets of sticky glue. Then came the roly-poly bird flying in after them with a bucket in its beak and a brush in its claws.